Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today we're going to talk about megafauna in Madagascar. And I did a video about Madagascar last year, and it revolved around human habitation of Madagascar going back 8,000 years further than the evidence that they had at that point. And so there were two migrations into Madagascar. One from Indonesia and then one from Africa, the African continent. And then they found a fossil of some bones of a human that went back 10,500 years. So the reason why that links to this article, is because on that island of Madagascar, that means that humans must have coexisted with megafauna that lived on the island before they went extinct. Only about 1,000 years ago, a little bit less than 1,000 years ago, that's when pretty much all the megafauna died off. And if you guys don't know what megafauna is, the definition is, I think, anything above 100 pounds. But this article talks about a study. One of the studies that they did set the threshold at 22 pounds. So I guess the not the goalpost, but the standards is a little bit different. But either way, they're big animals. Some of those megafauna are still around, like rhinoceros, hippopotamus, elephants, obviously. But there were other ones, like the giant, I think, a lemur. Yeah, this guy. This is the modern one now, but this is the skull of an actual lemur. That's how big it was. So I've talked about megafauna extinction in other videos too, especially ones involving the Younger Dryas and the megafauna of the North American continent and the South American continent. And the way they disappeared was very abrupt, much like the megafauna here, but there's some different discrepancies that the article doesn't really get into that I want to talk about, and that is why there's cataclysmic evidence of all the megafauna in the Americas disappearing in one fell swoop on a continent-wide basis, compared to Madagascar, which is a much smaller island, and the megafauna extinction there was more gradual. Although very quick, it happened very quickly as well, but it was also a more gradual process than what happened during the Younger Dryas episode in the Americas. So just to give you guys some context, over the past 40,000 years or so, the Earth was populated throughout the Pleistocene. They were characterized by all these megafauna, but they started to go extinct around 40,000 or so years ago. That's what the fossil record was indicating. Now, is this set in stone? Was it exactly 40,000 years ago? Of course not. This is just, I'm trying to fill you guys in on what's widely accepted. So this kind of educational context, or this historical context, so to speak, or archaeological context, if you will. One of the first things that's weird is there was that fauna crash during the Younger Dryas episode, which was over 10,000 years ago. In Madagascar, they were able to stick around up until 1,000 years ago. So past the time of Jesus and well into right before that, like during the Dark Ages, almost a little bit, or when we're coming out of the Dark Ages. That's when things went south for the megafauna. So what happened was, it wasn't overhunting. It wasn't solely overhunting. That's part of the equation, but this explanation is basically a conglomeration of things, and it brought about this theory, the subsistence theory, that we'll get into in a little bit later. So for animals over 22 pounds, there are abundant fossils up to 1,000 years ago, but relatively few since. The biggest decline in number of large animals occurred rapidly between 8,700 and 1,000. So that is, in the grand scope of things, that is instantaneous, but it still is more gradual, because the Younger Dryas was that episode supposedly killed everything off within weeks. Some say days. Some will say months, but very, very short compared to 300 years here. So that right there should clue you in onto the why the explanation for the disappearance of both populations in different parts of the world. It matters. It's a huge clue. So one of the things they did was they wanted to test the original hypothesis was, oh, they were going through a drought, and that's probably what happened. And then they did a chemical analysis of fossils, and they studied stalagmites, which are the things that come up from the bottom up in caves. And they found that there was no significant drying at that time, and in fact, it was a pretty wet season. So that was out. But then the stalagmite records did indicate a rapid change in the landscape. So this is where we're going to get into why the forests transitioned into grasslands. And that has to do with subsistence culture, subsistence farming, raising cattle. And they knew that they had cattle because they checked sediments and they found cow dung. They found butchery marks on the animals of not only the cattle, but also some of the megafauna that they were hunting. So we have this subsistence. Not only do we have this transition from hunter-gatherers to this farming about 1,000 years ago or so, but they were happening at the same time. So again, there's this compounding effect with the landscape continually changing. So we don't have as much of a diverse landscape anymore for the megafauna were accustomed to for thousands and thousands of years, way back into the Pleistocene. And then the fact that humans lived alongside and sustainably hunted megafauna for the 9,000 years before, that also clues you in that it wasn't just overhunting, because theoretically they would have if that were true, they would have overhunted them thousands of years earlier. So a lot of these I guess proponents of this overhunting theory, when they apply it to a place as big as North America, that is just ridiculous. The reason why overhunting would even have more of an effect in Madagascar is because it's an island. So the megafauna will eventually run out of land to flee to migrate to escape this human persecution, this human hunting. Because on a continent, that's what they would have done. There's so much land. There's no way that they would have been overhunted just by a small human a comparably small human population armed with just spears and stuff. They didn't have guns, or they didn't have gunpowder. They didn't have explosives or any of that stuff. They had to go on foot and use spears, and that just wasn't going to fly. So that right there is a very key point that I wanted to convey to you guys. Like this, the transition from a forest-dominated ecosystem to a grassland-dominated ecosystem appears to be widespread during this time. So logic follows that once you have 250, 300 years of this what you would call a shift in consciousness and a shift in a lifestyle that starts with an idea, and then it passes on to communities, and then from communities you have cities and villages and stuff like that. And then you see it affect the physical world in the form of farmland and slash and burn technique. Yeah, a lot of stuff is gonna die, and it'll attract other animals that would thrive in that atmosphere, like bees, certain types of insects, but birds, like giant birds that live in trees, again, big animals like lemurs and other like ground sloths. All those guys are gone to be replaced by these more agricultural friendly life forms. So this article is very interesting because you can see ideology in action. Is ideology the right word? Maybe it's not the right word, but it's definitely a shift in the way people view the world. So, for instance, if you take a hunter-gatherer and then a farmer, like let's say a Bronze Age farmer or something like that, and you compare the two, and you interview them, assuming that you can communicate with them, they're gonna have completely different views of the world. Their perspectives they might as well be from different planets almost, because the way their lifestyles are different, just fundamentally different. One group of people, they need to travel and they need to see the world. They need to be in tune with their environment, the wild, in order to navigate their life and follow. So, for example, go where the food goes, go where the water is. They gotta follow the migrating animals. There's a lot of stuff they have to do. It requires completely different faculties. Whereas a farmer needs to thrive, they need to create their own environment to cultivate their own crops, and their survival depends on weather patterns, but they can stay stationary. That's complete. Those are, again, two completely different ways of viewing things. So if you can get a population to switch, to just change their lifestyle, they somehow get it in their head from somewhere. Because remember, this idea has to come from somewhere, guys. It's not just a switch that goes off when you have generations prior. They're doing what works for thousands and thousands of years. When there's a nuclear bomb, or if there's nuclear fallout, if humans survive, it's going to be hunter-gatherers. Their world won't change very much because they're living in tune with nature, and nature always finds a way, right? Whereas people, if you were born and raised in the city, and the city again derives from an agricultural lifestyle, it's a stationary thing, then they're screwed. Their environment's done, and they don't have time to acclimate to a new environment. So this article is a very good example, again, to see this in action. So when people talk about Göbekli Tepe, it really does make more sense that it could be a center for these types of ideas to basically to ensure survival of that agrarian way of life that probably is much older than 9,000 years. That way of life was probably a relic. It's an ethereal, I don't want to say ethereal, but it's a non-physical remnant of the ancient civilization that was into the Pleistocene before us. And perhaps other cousins of Homo sapiens had this ability as well. Maybe that's where we got it from. Who knows? Some people think it's divine, which a lot of scripture says is, and a lot of people seem to be tuning in, being turned on to that type of thinking. And then this whole hypothesis, or this whole thing led to this hypothesis called the subsistence shift hypothesis. So it's just what I've been talking about. Both the habitat loss and increase in human population arose out of a fundamental change in the way humans lived on Madagascar, from a more nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle to an agrarian society. And it's very interesting. They use the term reorganization. They say this reorganization happened in around 8700 to 1000. Very interesting. Is it a coincidence that this also happens to be a time when the climate is shifting? We're at least in Europe anyway. I'm not sure about Madagascar, but the Renaissance and stuff was, if you look at the climate dates and when the Renaissance was, and the Renaissance is the advent of all these new ideas when there's a higher population, harvests were good, and that's because it's linked to good weather. And then we slipped into the Little Ice Age after that, which we just got out of like 150 years ago. So again, we're in one of these warm periods. Here's another interesting bit. Small populations of megafauna lived on in isolated pockets for another few centuries after that. So they weren't, even after all this, some escaped into pockets on the island, and then eventually they were gone because by that point there's just not enough mating pairs. They're too few and far between. But the reason why they're in those pockets is because what I was just talking about before. What would happen on a continent when they're running? It wouldn't be like that on a continental scale. They would run away, but not to pockets. They would just reintegrate into uninhabited lands of humans, and they have a whole continent to do that. So this is like a square footage issue almost. So let me know what you guys think about this. I think this is a very enlightening article, even though it does seem simple, but it tells a lot more than what's written, if that makes sense. Especially when you compare it to other megafaunal extinctions, especially the continent-wide ones in the Americas. So let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you guys later.